Finally did my reread of Magician Apprentice and Magician Master by Raymond E. Feist, which together are book one of the Rift War saga. These are kind of considered older fantasy now. First published in 1982. I have the author's preferred edition, so like 10 years after these were first published, when he started to be making more of a name for himself, he was well enough thought of and had sold enough books that he could go back and redo a little, add a few scenes that he wanted in there, and make it more the story that he wanted than the publishers wanted. I don't know if I read the author's preferred edition back in high school when I first read them, but that's what I just reread. These are very classic high fantasy, definitely inspired by the Lord of the Rings. I think that's pretty undeniable, but also inspired by the author and his friends' D&D campaign, which I think I read that after I had finished them and I was like looking up about them a little bit. But after reading that there was D&D inspiration, I could immediately see it. So this book is sometimes published as one book just called Magician. I think maybe the American version is the one that's split into two. So I have it as two parts. It takes place on two separate worlds. There are multiple point of view characters and it spans quite a long space of time. There's also kind of a big shift between the first and second one, so to me it makes a lot of sense that it's two books. The first one, Magician Apprentice, is a much smaller scope. We're following the kitchen boy, Pug, and it starts really slow. Like so slow that I don't know that he could have gotten away with that kind of start in today's publishing market, where you have to grip your reader on the first page. It does not start with any kind of action or anything even really interesting. It's like Pug, a teenage boy, just playing on the beach. He's just enjoying some time. He went down to get some seafood in his bag and he's taking his time, enjoying the freedom from the kitchen. I think he falls asleep, the waves come to get him and he has to run back and he hurts his ankle and he gets taken in by the friendly neighborhood Franklin, who happens to live with the local magician, which is where it starts to pick up a little bit and get a little bit more interesting. In this first book, the main character is Pug. We're pretty much just following him. We do get a little bit of his friend Thomas. Not just friend, but brothers. Pug has been adopted into Thomas's family. Thomas's parents run the kitchen at Castle Cryde. So they've been raised together, and coming up is their celebration. I don't remember what it's called. The celebration where the boys become men and they get chosen by crafts masters to start apprenticeships. Thomas gets the apprenticeship that all the boys want, which is being chosen by the sword master. Pug gets a much more unconventional apprenticeship with Duke Boric's magician, the one that he had met in the forest earlier. Thus the name, Magician Apprentice. So it's pretty straightforward. Pug and Thomas are teenage boys. They get to travel, have adventures. I felt like it was a very accurate representation of reading from a teenage boy's point of view. And I do feel like over the course of the two books, as the teenage boys matured, the point of view and the way we are seeing the world also matures. There is one scene in a bedroom between the main character Pug and the girl he likes, the princess, that I was kind of rolling my eyes at the way that the girl was being portrayed. And the only thing that kind of excused that portrayal of the teenage girl to me was that she was being seen through the eyes of a teenage boy. And if it had been an adult male character viewing her that way, it would have been far less excusable. And overall, one of my complaints is how the female characters are written. I know it's kind of a common complaint in fantasy written by men. They're not horrible, but they're not treated like main characters, and they don't have as much depth as the male characters. I have one of Feist's newer series. It's been a while since I read the first couple books of it, and I can't remember if I feel like he's gotten better at that over time or not. I'd have to read it again to see. But it's definitely just told from that male point of view, probably written with a male audience in mind, which is fine. I've read far worse. The women aren't horribly done, just not as well as I would have liked to see. So in this first half, there is a definite, strong feeling of the Lord of the Rings inspiration. You have, besides humans, elves, dwarves, goblins, dragons, wizards, which in this book are called magicians and sorcerers. But I felt like the Lord of the Rings inspiration was done in a way that I prefer, which is the author takes the inspiration, things he liked from the Lord of the Rings, and twisted it more into his own ideas, his own flavor. Like, let Tolkien come up with the ideas and then I'll take that and make my own variation, do it in my own style. Whereas I've read some others that were far less imaginative and just more straight up like stealing from the Lord of the Rings. And then in the second half, Magician Master, it starts to expand a lot more. It expands in the point of view characters. So we're not just seeing from Pug's point of view anymore, we are seeing from others. We are seeing from other characters that we met in the first book, and we get to see the other world. In the first book, the other world is like this mysterious place that they know pretty much nothing about except that they have started a war. Soldiers are coming through this rift in time and space, probably, and are trying to invade and take it over. In this one, we as the readers get to go to that other world and see what it's like. We get to start seeing the war that's happening from both perspectives. We get to see each side. The two sides being Midkemia, where we started, and Kellowan. For Midkemia, the war is a lot more about survival, fighting off this invading enemy, and the war goes on for a long time. It starts to drain their resources, and they are getting more and more desperate. Whereas on Kellowan, we see that it's a lot more just politically inspired. No one is super passionate about this war. It just has to do with political maneuvering and who gains power, which is really disheartening for the Midkemians who find this out. And the other world seems a lot more inspired by like imperialistic China than by the medieval kind of European feel that Midkemia has, and then those two worlds clashing just adds an interesting flavor to the world building. And when you get those more expanded point of view chapters from other characters like Prince Arutha, Thomas, Martin, there would be like a whole chapter that was really long just following Prince Arutha from Castle Cryde, Duke Boric's younger son. We'd follow him for this long chapter and get this whole like almost self-contained little story, and then next chapter switch to another character, and sometimes there will have been months or even years between chapters. So while there's a time jump between these first two, there's also time jumps just within this one, and so from beginning to end, quite a long time has passed, maybe up to 10 years, I think. And I almost felt like there was too much from the other point of view characters that didn't really matter to the whole story. So I don't know how much of that was put in later into the author's preferred edition. Scenes with Arutha, Martin, Thomas, just the ones who aren't Pug, or the ones that don't have to do with Pug's storyline or the war or whatever, because sometimes it felt like very separate stories going on, just getting shuffled together. And it does all come together at the end. Those all do wrap up at the end, but it might have been a little more expanded than it needed to be. I will say, when I was in high school, I read Magician Master first because I saw my friend reading it, and I read a couple pages over her shoulder and I thought it looked really cool. The part I read over her shoulder was the arena scene, if you know what scene I'm talking about, where there's some really cool, like, large-scale magic happening. And so I asked to borrow it from her. She didn't even ask me if I wanted to read Apprentice first. So much, much later, going back to read Apprentice, it was this strange experience of feeling like I was reading this prequel or this origin story. Starting the second one, the characters have already been through so much and are like at a starting point of experience, strength, power, already pretty competent at what they do. Oh man. I definitely recommend reading them in order though. It is a better experience that way. And on a reread, there is a lot of little foreshadowing, little clues in there of things that happen later that you would never know is referring to something in the future until you go back and read it again. I love little details like that. One thing that I found a little weird was the perspective that the story is being told from. Sometimes it was hard to tell whether it was being told from a third-person omniscient versus there being like POV errors. So like in the first part, if Pug is the main character, we're following him, we're seeing into his mind and what he's thinking about stuff, and then he leaves the room. Instead of us leaving the room with him, we see what the character in the room with him thinks after Pug leaves. And then sometimes even characters in the same physical space with each other, there's a little head hopping, seeing into characters' brains that normally if you're sticking with a third person limited, or especially in a first person, you don't get to see what the other characters are thinking. You get to see what your main character thinks, and that's it. So some of that when it happened was humorous, like something would happen and another character would think something maybe funny or sarcastic or something, but it was a little confusing at first until I just got the hang of character to character to character. It was a little tropey, could have been a little more cohesive. I felt like the ending was pretty solid. Solid enough that you could just stop after these two and be fine, or go into the rest of the Rift War saga if you are so inclined. And overall, being a little bit on the older side, being books that I read first as a teenager and I'm rereading now in my 30s, I still liked them. Yes, now I could see more of the flaws, the little things that maybe could have been done better, but it was still an enjoyable reading experience, and I think I would still recommend them. And then I have to decide if the next Raymond E. Feist book I read is the next one in the Rift War saga, or the newer series that my husband bought me the third one of and I have not read yet. Thank you to my patrons. I really appreciate you guys. I will link my Patreon and my Instagram and Feist's website so you can check out other books he's written. And I hope you're enjoying whatever you're reading right now. Happy reading.